Soldiers with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Well, thank you for joining another episode of Traveling Through History. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the 34th United States president, and that was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Of course, Eisenhower had risen up through the ranks in the military, starting at West Point as a student and then rising up all the way through the ranks, going rank after rank, and really gaining prominence in World War II, where he rose all the way to the rank of Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. He had actually led the force that had taken over Italy, starting in Sicily and then liberating the rest of Italy all the way up through to the northern part of Italy. And then, of course, the most famous thing that he ever did in the military was he was the Allied commander for World War II for all the Allied forces during D-Day. D-Day being one of the toughest jobs any military commander would ever have to plan for and to make orders for. And that's what he had to do. That was his responsibility. He had very famous generals reporting to him, people like George Patton throughout, but he had to make all the tough calls. And as you know from history, and if you saw our episode on D-Day, you'll realize that the Allies were successful, largely because of Eisenhower and the many important generals that were around him, both United States generals and Allied generals. And so this was the way that Dwight D. Eisenhower became famous, was through his military career, all the way to the point where he decided to run for president of the United States and won. And he won during a period of great changeover between World War II and some of the more modern conflicts that we had to deal with all the way up to today. He was a very consequential president, very important president. And we'll talk about tonight his early history, his military career, all the way through this important time in World War II, where he helped win the war on behalf of the United States and the Allies, and then all the way through his presidency and some of the consequential things that he did as president. He was affectionately known to the American people as Ike. He had possibly the most famous campaign slogan ever in American history, and that was, "I like Ike." And "I like Ike" signs were all over the country in all 50 states, on every billboard sign, in every neighborhood, in front of about 60% of the homes. It was an incredibly powerful, very short statement that really gave new life to the Republican Party. The Republican Party at the time had not been in power for many, many years, had lost the White House for several decades, and really he was taking over from a Democratic regime that had been in place for a long time, including through all the Roosevelt years. And so we'll talk about that, a very important changeover in American politics and why it came about. Let's go ahead and get into the history of Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Dwight D. Eisenhower was born October 14th, 1890, and he died in March 28th, 1969. Although known by his name Ike, and was the 34th president serving from 1953 to 1961. Also known by his name Ike, and was the 34th president of the United States serving from 1953 to 1961, 2 full terms. During World War II, he was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe and achieved the 5-star rank as General of the Army. Eisenhower planned and supervised two of the most consequential military campaigns in World War II, and really two of the biggest operations in world history. The first one was Operation Torch in the North Africa campaign in 1942 and 1943. And then he also planned, of course, the invasion of Normandy in 1944, the most consequential in all of the war. Eisenhower was born in Denison, Texas, and raised in Abilene, Kansas, on the plains of Kansas. His family had a very strong religious background, and his mother became a Jehovah's Witness and was a pacifist and very much against the military. Eisenhower, however, belonged to no organized church until 1952. He graduated from West Point in 1915 and later married Mamie Doud, with whom he had 2 sons. During World War I, he was denied a request to serve in Europe and instead commanded a unit that trained tank crews in the United States. Between the wars, he served in staff positions in the U.S. and in the Philippines, reaching the rank of brigadier general shortly before the entry of the U.S. into World War II in 1941. After further promotion, Eisenhower oversaw the Allied invasions of North Africa, Sicily, mainland Italy, before then supervising the invasions of France and then Germany. After the war ended in Europe, he served as military governor of the American-occupied zone of Germany for the entire year of 1945. He was then Army Chief of Staff from 1945 to 1948, and he was president of Columbia University from 1948 to 1953, a full 5 years in academia. And he was the first Supreme Commander of NATO from 1951 to 1952. So as NATO was being formed, Eisenhower was the natural choice to lead that organization. In 1952, Eisenhower entered the presidential race as a Republican to block the isolationist foreign policies of Senator Robert A. Taft, who opposed NATO. Eisenhower won that year's election and the 1956 election in landslides, both times defeating Adlai Stevenson. Eisenhower's main goals in office were to contain the spread of communism and reduce federal deficits. In 1953, he considered using nuclear weapons to end the Korean War and may have threatened China with nuclear attack if the armistice was not reached quickly. China did agree an armistice was resulted from the activity, which remains in effect even today. His New Look policy of nuclear deterrence prioritized inexpensive nuclear weapons while reducing funding for expensive army divisions. He continued Harry S. Truman's policy of recognizing Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, and he won congressional approval of the Formosa Resolution. His administration provided major aid to help the French fight off Vietnamese communists in the First Indochina War. After the French left, he gave strong financial support to the new state of South Vietnam. He supported regime change military coups in Iran and Guatemala, and he orchestrated them by his own administration. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, he condemned the Israeli, British, and French invasion of Egypt, and he forced them to withdraw from Egypt at the time. He also condemned the Soviet invasion during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, but took no action to stop it. He deployed 15,000 soldiers during the 1958 Lebanon crisis. Near the end of his term, a summit meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was canceled when the U.S. spy plane was shot down over Soviet Union, which was called the U-2 affair. Eisenhower approved the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was left to John F. Kennedy to carry out after he left office. On the domestic front, Eisenhower governed as a moderate conservative who continued New Deal agencies and policies and expanded Social Security. So essentially, he took over from Roosevelt, and on the domestic side, he was very moderate and carried a lot of those policies forward. On the military and financial side, he was more conservative. He covertly opposed Joseph McCarthy and contributed to the end of McCarthyism by openly invoking executive privilege. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and sent Army troops to enforce federal court orders which integrated schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. His administration undertook the development and construction of the interstate highway system all across the country. So very, very prominent things he was doing in his administration, as you can see. That interstate highway system, which remains the largest construction of roadways in American history. In 1957, following the Soviet launch of Sputnik, Eisenhower led the American response, which included the creation of NASA and the establishment of a stronger science-based education via the National Defense Education Act. The Soviet Union began to reinforce their own space program, escalating the space race. His 2 terms saw unprecedented economic prosperity across the country. All states were improved financially after he left office. There was, however, a minor recession in 1958, which was a very shallow one and was over very quickly. In his farewell address, he expressed his concerns about the dangers of massive military spending, particularly deficit spending, and government contracts to private military manufacturers, which he dubbed the military-industrial complex, which we still talk about today. Historical evaluations of his presidency place him among the upper tier of U.S. presidents. He's actually in the top 20 of all presidents. In terms of his family background, the Eisenhower name actually came from German, which meant iron hewer or iron miner. That's what the name actually means. His family migrated from the German village Karlsbrunn to the province of Pennsylvania here in the United States in 1741. Accounts vary as to how and when German name Eisenhower was anglicized and spelled the way it is today. David Jacob Eisenhower, who was Eisenhower's father, was a college-educated engineer despite his own father's urging to stay on the family farm. Eisenhower's mother, Ida Elizabeth Eisenhower, of predominantly German Protestant ancestry, moved to Kansas from Virginia, and that's where she met her husband. She married David on September 23, 1885, in Lecompton, Kansas, on the campus of their alma mater, Lane University. David owned a general store in Hope, Kansas, but the business failed due to economic conditions, and the family became very impoverished at the time. The Eisenhowers lived in Texas from 1889 until 1892, and later returned to Kansas. With $24, or the equivalent of $840 today, to their name. David worked as a railroad mechanic and then at creameries just to get by. By 1898, the parents made a decent living and provided a suitable home for their large family that was growing. Eisenhower was born David Dwight Eisenhower. He was the third of 7 sons to be born to Ida and David. So you can see they had 7 total sons and he was the third. Pretty incredible. His mother soon reversed his 2 forenames after his birth to avoid confusion of having 2 Davids in the family. So she essentially made David his middle name. He was named Dwight after the evangelist Dwight L. Moody. All of the boys were nicknamed Ike, such as Big Ike, Little Ike, Middle Ike. The name was intended as an abbreviation of their last name. By World War II, only Dwight was still called Ike. In 1892, the family moved to Abilene, Kansas, which Eisenhower considered his hometown and where he was raised. As a child, he was involved in an accident that cost his younger brother Earl an eye, for which he was remorseful for the rest of his life. Eisenhower developed a keen and enduring interest in exploring the outdoors. He learned about hunting and fishing and cooking and playing cards from a man named Bob Davis, who camped on the Smoky Hill River not too far from his house. While his mother was against war and was a pacifist, it was her collection of history books that first sparked Eisenhower's interest in military history. He became a voracious reader on the subject. Other favorite subjects early in his career were arithmetic and spelling. Eisenhower's parents set aside specific times at breakfast and at dinner for daily family Bible reading. Chores were regularly assigned and rotated among all the children, and misbehavior was met with unequivocal discipline, usually from David. His mother, previously a member of the River Brethren, joined the International Bible Students Association, later known as the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Eisenhower home served as a local meeting hall for those Jehovah's Witnesses from 1896 to 1915, though Dwight never joined the church. His later decision to attend West Point saddened his mother, who felt that warfare was rather wicked and that she did not approve of his decision but did not overrule it. Speaking of himself in 1948, Eisenhower said that he was one of the most deeply religious men I know, though unattached to any sect or organization specifically. He was baptized in the Presbyterian Church in 1953. Eisenhower attended the Abilene High School and graduated in 1909, and as a freshman, he injured his knee and developed a leg infection that extended into his groin, which the doctor diagnosed as life-threatening. The doctor insisted that he have his leg amputated, but Dwight refused to allow it, and surprisingly recovered and was fully able after that, though he had to repeat his freshman year because of the sickness. He and his brother Edgar both wanted to attend college, though they both lacked the funds. They made a pact to take alternate years in college while the other worked to earn the tuitions. Edgar took the first turn at school, and Dwight was employed as a night supervisor at the Bell Springs Creamery. When Edgar asked for a second year, Dwight consented. At that time, a friend, Edward Swede Hazlitt, was applying to the Naval Academy, and he urged Dwight to apply as well, since no tuition was required. Eisenhower requested consideration for either Annapolis or West Point with his Senator Joseph L. Bristow. Though Eisenhower was among the winners of the entrance exam competition, he was beyond the age limit for the Naval Academy. He accepted an appointment to West Point in 1911. At West Point, Eisenhower relished his emphasis on traditions and on sports, but was less enthusiastic about the hazing that went on, though he willingly accepted it as a plebe. He was also a regular violator of more detailed regulations and finished school with less than a stellar discipline rating. Academically, Eisenhower's best subject was by far English. Otherwise, his performance was just average in the class, though he thoroughly enjoyed his typical emphasis on engineering and science and mathematics. In athletics, Eisenhower later said that not making the baseball team at West Point was one of the greatest disappointments of his life, maybe the greatest. He made the varsity football team, however, and was a starter at halfback in 1912. He tried to tackle the legendary Jim Thorpe of the Carlisle Indians during that year. Eisenhower suffered a torn knee while being tackled in the next game after that, which was the last time he played. He re-injured his knee on horseback and in the boxing ring after that. So he turned to fencing and to gymnastics and gave up the sport of football. Eisenhower later served as a junior varsity football coach, which caught the attention of General Frederick Funston. He graduated from West Point in the middle of the class in 1915, which became known as the class the stars fell on, because 59 members of his class eventually became generals. Can you believe that? Out of 168, 59 became generals. After graduation in 1915, Second Lieutenant Eisenhower requested an assignment in the Philippines, which was denied. Because of the ongoing Mexican Revolution, he was posted to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, under the command of General Funston. In 1916, while stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Funston convinced him to become the football coach for Peacock Military Academy. He later became the coach at St. Louis College, now St. Mary's University. and was an honorary member of the Sigma Beta Chi fraternity there. While Eisenhower was stationed in Texas, he met Mamie Doud of Boone, Iowa. They were immediately taken with each other, and he proposed to her on Valentine's Day, 1916. A November wedding date in Denver was moved up to July 1st due to the impending American entry into World War I. Funston approved 10 days of leave for their wedding. The Eisenhowers moved many times during their first 35 years of marriage. The Eisenhowers had two sons. In late 1917, when he was in charge of training at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, his wife Mamie had their first son, Doud Dwight "Icky" Eisenhower, who died of scarlet fever at the age of 3. Eisenhower was most reluctant to discuss his death. Their second son, John Eisenhower, was born in Denver, Colorado. John served in the United States military many years later and retired as a brigadier general, much like his father. Also became an author and served as ambassador to Belgium from 1969 to 1971. John married Barbara Jean Thompson and had 4 children: David, Barbara Ann, Susan Elaine, Mary Jean. David, after whom Camp David is named, married Richard Nixon's daughter Julie in 1968. Eisenhower was a golf enthusiast for later in life, and he joined the Augusta National Golf Club in 1948. He played golf frequently during and after his presidency and was unreserved in his passion for the game, to the part of golfing during the winter if he could. He ordered his golf balls painted black so that he could see them better against the snow. He had a basic golf facility installed at Camp David, and he became close friends with Augusta National Chairman Clifford Roberts, inviting Roberts to stay at the White House on numerous occasions. Roberts, an investment banker, also handled the Eisenhower family's investments. He began oil painting while at Columbia University after watching Thomas E. Stevens paint Mamie's portrait. Eisenhower painted about 260 oil paintings himself during the last 20 years of his life. The images were mostly landscapes, but also portraits of subjects such as Mamie, their grandchildren, and other friends. A conservative in both art and politics, Eisenhower, in a 1962 speech, denounced modern art as a piece of canvas that looks like a broken down Tin Lizzie. Angels in the Outfield was Eisenhower's favorite movie. His favorite reading material for relaxation were the Western novels of Zane Grey. While his excellent memory and ability to focus, Eisenhower was skilled at cards. He learned to play poker, which he called his favorite indoor sport. In Abilene, Eisenhower recorded West Point classmates' poker losses for payment after graduation, and later stopped playing because his opponents resented having to pay him all the time. A friend reported that after learning to play contract bridge at West Point, Eisenhower played the game 6 nights a week for 5 months. Eisenhower continued to play bridge throughout his military career, and while stationed in the Philippines, he played regularly with the President Manuel Quezon of the Philippines. Eisenhower served initially in logistics in World War I, and then in the infantry in various camps in Texas and in Georgia until 1918. When the U.S. entered World War I, he immediately requested an overseas assignment, but was denied and assigned to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In February 1918, he was transferred to Camp Meade in Maryland with the 65th Engineers. His unit was later ordered to France, but to his chagrin, he received orders to the new Tank Corps, where he was promoted to brevet lieutenant colonel in the National Army. He commanded a unit that trained tank crews at Camp Colt, his first command. Though Eisenhower and his tank crews never saw combat, he displayed excellent organizational skills as well as an ability to accurately assess junior officers' strengths and weaknesses. His spirits were raised when the unit under his command received orders overseas to France, and he got letters back from them while they were in action. His in-between time between the two wars, he was in the service of many different generals. After the war, Eisenhower reverted to his regular work of captain, and a few days later was promoted to major, a rank he held for 16 years. The major was assigned in 1919 to the Transcontinental Army convoy to test vehicles and dramatize the need for improved roads. Indeed, the convoy averaged only 5 miles per hour from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, a cross-country trip. Later improvement of the highways that came under his presidency, one of his signature issues, was one of the reasons that he was interested in that project because of the slow progress of this convoy. He assumed duties again at Camp Meade, Maryland, commanding a battalion of tanks, where he remained until 1922. From 1920, Eisenhower served a succession of talented generals: Fox Connor, John Pershing, Douglas MacArthur, and George Marshall, all very famous generals in their own right. He first became executive officer to George Connor in the Panama Canal Zone, where, joined by Mamie, he served until 1924. During the 1920s and 1930s, Eisenhower's career stalled somewhat as military priorities diminished in between wars. He was assigned to the American Battle Monuments Commission, directed by General Pershing, and with the help of his brother Milton Eisenhower, then a journalist at the Agriculture Department, he produced a guide to American battlefields of Europe. He then assigned to the Army War College and graduated in 1928 with a master's degree. After a one-year assignment in France, Eisenhower served as executive officer to George V. Moseley, Assistant Secretary of the War. Major Eisenhower graduated from the Army Industrial College in 1933 and later served on the faculty of that institution. His primary duty during this period was to plan for the next war, which proved most difficult in the midst of the Great Depression. He then was posted as Chief Military Aide to General Douglas MacArthur, Army Chief of Staff. In 1932, he participated in the clearing of the Bonus March encampment in Washington, D.C., although he was against the actions taken against the veterans that strongly advised MacArthur against taking note of it. In terms of World War II, Eisenhower returned to the United States in December 1939 and was assigned as commanding officer of the 1st Battalion at Fort Lewis, Washington. In March 1941, he was promoted to colonel and assigned as Chief of Staff to the newly activated 9th Corps under Major General Kenyon Joyce. In June 1941, he was appointed Chief of Staff to General Walker Kruger, commander of the 3rd Army at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, a place he had been stationed before. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower was assigned to the General Staff in Washington, where he served until June 1942, with responsibility for creating the major war plans to defeat Japan and Germany in the war. He was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff in charge of Pacific defenses under the Chief War Plans Division, General Leonard Garrow, and then succeeded Garrow as Chief of War Plans Division. Next, he was appointed Assistant Chief of Staff in charge of the new Operations Division under Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, who spotted talent and promoted him accordingly. At the end of May 1942, Eisenhower accompanied Lieutenant General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, to London to assess the effectiveness and possibility of theater commander in England. He returned to Washington on June 3rd with a pessimistic assessment stating that he had an uneasy feeling about Cheney and their staff in England. On June 23, 1942, he returned to London as commanding general of the European Theater. He took over command of that organization from Cheney. He was promoted to lieutenant general on July 7th. In November 1942, Eisenhower was also appointed Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Force in Northern Africa Theater of Operations. The word expeditionary was dropped soon afterwards. The campaign in North Africa was designated as Operation Torch and was planned in the underground headquarters within the Rock of Gibraltar. Eisenhower was the first non-British person to command a Gibraltar force in 200 years. French cooperation was deemed necessary to campaign and Eisenhower encountered a preposterous situation with multiple rival factions in France that he had to deal with. His primary objective was to move forces successfully into Tunisia and to fight against Germans on all fronts. Operation Torch also served as a valuable training ground for Eisenhower's combat command skills. During the initial phase of this particular offensive, Eisenhower created some confusion in the ranks by interference with the execution of battle plans with his subordinates. He also was initially indecisive in his removal of Lloyd Friendeschal. In February 1943, his authority was extended as commander across the Mediterranean basin to include British Eighth Army, commanded by General Sir Bernard Montgomery. After the capitulation of Axis forces in North Africa, and he won the entire offensive, Eisenhower oversaw the invasion of Sicily. It was his next action. Once Mussolini, the Italian leader, had fallen in Italy, the Allies switched their attention to the mainland with Operation Avalanche. But while Eisenhower argued with President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Churchill, who both insisted on unconditional surrender in exchange for helping the Italians, the Germans pursued an aggressive buildup of forces in their country. The Germans made the already tough battle more difficult by adding 19 divisions and initially outnumbering the Allied forces 2-1. In December of 1943, President Roosevelt decided that Eisenhower, not Marshall, would be the supreme Allied commander of all European forces for the Allies. The following month, he resumed command of ETO-USA, and the following month was officially designated as the supreme Allied commander of the Allied force. He was charged in these positions with planning and carrying out the Allied assault on the coast of Normandy in June of 1944, under the codename Operation Overlord, the liberation of Western Europe and the invasion of Germany, the most important offensive in the entire war. Eisenhower, as well as the officers and troops underneath him, had learned valuable lessons in their previous operations, both in North Africa and in Italy. Their skills had all strengthened in preparation for the next most difficult campaign against the Germans. His first struggles, however, were with Allied leaders and officers on matters vital to the success of the Normandy invasion. He argued with Roosevelt over an essential agreement with de Gaulle to use French resistance troops in covert operations against the Germans in advance of Operation Overlord. Admiral Ernst King fought with Eisenhower over the King's refusal to provide additional landing craft from the Pacific. Eisenhower also insisted that the British give him exclusive command over all strategic air forces to facilitate Operation Overlord, to the point of threatening to resign unless Churchill relented, which he did. Eisenhower then designated a bombing plan in France in advance of Overlord and argued with Churchill over the latter's concern with civilian casualties. De Gaulle interjected that the casualties were justified, and Eisenhower prevailed on this as well. He also had to skillfully manage to retain services of the often unruly George S. Patton by severely reprimanding him when Patton earlier had slapped his subordinate, and then when Patton gave a speech in which he made improper comments about post-war policy. The D-Day Normandy landings on June 6, 1944 were costly but successful. 2 months later, in August the 15th, the invasion of southern France took place, and control of forces in the southern invasion passed from AFHQ to SHAEF, another organization under Eisenhower. Many thought that victory in Europe will come by summer's end, but the Germans did not capitulate for almost the entire year. From then until the end of the war in Europe, on May 8, 1945, Eisenhower commanded all of Allied forces. He was ever mindful of the inevitable loss of life and suffering that would be experienced by the troops under his command and their families. This prompted him to make the point of visiting every division involved in the invasion. Eisenhower's sense of responsibility had uncovered and underscored his draft statement of the invasion. Our landings in Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I've withdrawn the troops. His quote about the liberation of France and victory in Europe, he said, "Every ground commander seeks the battle of annihilation. So, as far as conditions permit, he tries to duplicate in modern war the classic example of Cannae." Once the coastal assault had been succeeded, Eisenhower insisted on retaining personal control over the land battle strategy and was immersed completely in command and control of the entire operation the rest of the war. In recognition of his senior position in Allied command, on December 20th, 1944, he was promoted to General of the Army, a 5-star position. He interacted adeptly with allies such as Winston Churchill, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and General Charles de Gaulle. He had serious disagreements with Churchill and Montgomery over questions of strategy, but these rarely upset his relationships with them personally. He dealt with Soviet Marshal Zhukov, his Russian counterpart, and they became friends as well. In December 1944, Germans launched a surprise counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, which the Allies successfully repelled in early 1945 after Eisenhower repositioned his armies and improved weather allowed the Army's force to engage. German defenses continued to deteriorate, both the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Throughout 1945, the Allied armies liberated numerous Nazi concentration camps throughout Europe. As the Allies learned the full extent of the Holocaust, Eisenhower anticipated that in the future, attempts to recharacterize Nazi crimes as propaganda would be made. He took steps against this by demanding extensive photo and film documentation of the Nazi death camps. In terms of the 1948 presidential election, in June 1943, a visiting politician suggested to Eisenhower that he might become president after the war one day. Believing that a general should not participate in politics, he wrote that, figuratively speaking, Eisenhower kicked his political-minded visitor out of the office. As others asked him about his political future, Eisenhower told one that he could not imagine wanting to be considered for any political job, much less president of the United States. In 1945, Truman told Eisenhower during the Potsdam Conference that if desired, the president would help the general win the 1948 election. And in 1947, he offered to run as Eisenhower's running mate on the Democratic ticket if MacArthur won the Republican nomination. As the election approached, other prominent citizens and politicians from both parties urged Eisenhower to run. In January 1948, after learning of plans in New Hampshire to select delegates supporting him for the forthcoming Republican National Convention, Eisenhower stated that though the Army he was not available for and could not accept nomination to a high political office, lifelong professional soldiers in politics, he wrote, in the absence of some obvious and overriding reason, should abstain from seeking high political office. Eisenhower maintained no political party affiliation during this time. Many believed he was foregoing his only opportunity to be president, as Republican Thomas E. Dewey was considered a probable winner and would presumably serve 2 terms, meaning that Eisenhower at age 66 in 1958 would be too old to run. In 1948, Eisenhower became president of Columbia University, an Ivy League university in New York City, and did that for a number of years. His stint as president of Columbia was punctuated by the activity within the Council on Foreign Relations, a study group that had led concerning the political and military implications of the Marshall Plan during the aftermath of World War II. His biographer, Blanche Wesson Cook, suggested that this period served as the political education, since he had no prioritization of wide-ranging educational, administrative, or financial demands from the university. Eisenhower accepted the presidency of the university to expand his ability to promote the American form of democracy through education. He was clear on his point in the trustees during the search committee process. He informed them that his main purpose was to promote the basic concepts of education and democracy. Within months of becoming university president, Eisenhower was requested to advise Secretary of Defense James Forrester on the unification of armed services. In terms of the presidential campaign of 1952, President Truman sensed a broad-based desire for an Eisenhower candidacy for president, and he again pressured him to run like he did many years earlier. But Eisenhower voiced his disagreements with the Democrats and declared himself as a Republican, to Truman's dismay. A draft Eisenhower movement in the Republican Party persuaded him to declare his candidacy for the 1952 presidential election to counter the candidacy of the non-interventionist Senator Robert A. Taft. The effort was a long struggle. Eisenhower had to be convinced that the political circumstances had created genuine duty to offer himself as a candidate, and that there was a mandate from the public for him to be their president. Eisenhower defeated Taft for the Republican nomination, having won critical delegate votes from Texas. His campaign was noted for the simple slogan, "I like Ike." It was essential to his success that Eisenhower expressed opposition to Roosevelt's policy at the Yalta Conference and to Truman's policies in Korea and China, matters in which he had once participated but was now completely against. In defeating Taft for the nomination, it became necessary for Eisenhower to appease the right-wing old guard of the Republican Party. His selection of Richard Nixon as his vice president to the ticket was designed in part for that purpose. Nixon also provided a strong anti-communist reputation, as well as youth to counter Eisenhower's more advanced age. Eisenhower insisted on campaigning in the South in the general election against the advice of his campaign team, refusing to surrender the region to the Democrats. The campaign strategy was dubbed K1C2 and intended to focus on attacking the Truman administration on three failures: the Korean War, communism, and corruption. Two controversies tested him and his staff. However, they went on to be victorious in that election in 1952, winning 52% of the popular vote. After a successful presidency with many of the programs we talked about earlier in the program tonight, he did run for re-election in 1956 and won quite handily, again against Stevenson. Initially, Eisenhower had only wanted to serve one term, but he remained flexible in that case, leading Republicans who wanted to have him run again. He was recovering from heart attack late in September 1955 when he met with his closest advisors to evaluate the GOP's potential candidates. The group concluded that the second term was well advised and that he could win. So he announced his run again in February 1956. Eisenhower was publicly non-committal about having Nixon as his vice president on his ticket the second time. The question was especially important one in light of his heart condition. He personally favored Robert B. Anderson, who was a Democrat at the time, but he rejected his offer. So Eisenhower resolved to leave the matter in the hands of the party, who chose Nixon again. So he had him as a second time. In 1956, Eisenhower faced Adlai Stevenson for the second time and won an even larger landslide with 457 electoral votes and 57% of the popular vote. In terms of the major policies that he took on during his presidency, both terms, was the atomic energy policies, both nuclear energy for domestic purposes and for military purposes, the Interstate Highway Program, which has been incredibly impactful for the entire United States, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, the foreign policy of being non-interventionist where possible, but strong and peace through strength, kicking off the space race with the Soviets and their Sputnik program and the NASA program being the competitor, the ending of the Korean War, and the détente with China. Having a peaceful Southeast Asia where South Vietnam and South Korea were supported, the legitimization of Francoist Spain, and then the peaceful transition of the Middle East to a more peaceful time. And what was called, with all of these policies all wrapped into one, what was called the Eisenhower Doctrine. So that gives you a really good sense for the history of Dwight D. Eisenhower, his rise through the ranks of the military after he started at West Point. He took about every different position in the military you could have. This incredible rise he had that culminated in rise all the way to the top general in the military in World War II at the very end of the war, after his tremendous success in helping the Allies win the most controversial war in world history. And then obviously a very successful two-term presidency as well at the end. Let's go ahead and take a look at a series of quick videos, and then we'll come back and talk about those on the other side.
Dwight D. Eisenhower was the 34th President of the United States. During World War II, he was the commanding general of the U.S. forces in the European theater.
Dwight D. Eisenhower was undoubtedly one of America's greatest military commanders.
Dwight D. Eisenhower was born in Denison, Texas on October 14, 1890.
Dwight Eisenhower graduated from West Point in the class of 1915, the class the stars fell on because so many of its members became general officers in World War II.
He was then stationed in Texas, and there is where he met his wife, Mamie Doud.
During World War I, Eisenhower steadily rose through the ranks, although he never left the U.S. mainland.
Prior to World War II, Eisenhower was serving with General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines and was at that time a lieutenant colonel.
Eisenhower was brought back to the U.S. in 1939 by Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall.
General Marshall saw that Eisenhower was quickly promoted from lieutenant colonel to major general and had him command Operation Torch, which was the invasion of North Africa in 1942. This was followed by the invasion of Sicily and mainland Italy in 1943 and the invasion of France in 1944.
He was in charge of Operation Overlord, the operation which resulted in the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the day that we know as D-Day.
Dwight D. Eisenhower was a great political general, which is exactly what was called for to keep the alliance together during World War II.
Eisenhower received a hero's welcome when he returned to the U.S. after the war in 1945. He then served as the Army's Chief of Staff before leaving the service in 1948 to become president of Columbia University.
In 1950, Eisenhower returned to military service when President Harry Truman asked him to become the NATO Supreme Commander, which was a newly created position.
In 1952, Eisenhower stepped down from his NATO position and ran for president. In the November 1952 election, he won the first of his 2 presidential terms in a landslide victory.
He continued many of the policies of the New Deal and FDR and Harry Truman, even though he was a Republican.
On civil rights, in 1957, there was the Little Rock school crisis. The governor of Arkansas didn't want to let African-American children enter the all-white school. Eisenhower sent federal troops to make sure that those students got to have their education there at Central High School in Little Rock.
Eisenhower's foreign policy achievements included an armistice that ended the Korean War, a ramping up of the Cold War where he increased surveillance against communism.
Dwight D. Eisenhower's lasting visible legacy, interesting enough, came in infrastructure. He was the father of the interstate highway system. He also created NASA.
Eisenhower was never known as a great public speaker, but many people believe that his final speech as president was his greatest one. In that speech, he expressed his concern about big business and the military establishment exerting too much influence on America's everyday life. Those concerns remain with us to this day.
After his presidency, Eisenhower retired to a farmhouse in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania with his wife in 1961. He died on March 28, 1969.
Fellow Americans, first I should like to express my gratitude to the radio and television networks for the opportunities they have given me over the years to bring reports and messages to our nation. My special thanks go to them for the opportunity of addressing you this evening. 3 days from now, after half a century in the service of our country, I shall lay down the responsibilities of office as
In traditional and solemn ceremony, the authority of the presidency is vested in my successor. This evening, I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. Like every other citizen, I wish the new president and all who will labor with him Godspeed. I pray that the coming years will be blessed with peace and prosperity for all. Our people expect their president and the Congress to find essential agreement on issues of great moment, the wise resolution of which will better shape the future of the nation. My own relations with the Congress, which began on a remote and tenuous basis when long ago a member of the Senate appointed me to West Point, have since ranged to the intimate during the war and immediate post-war period, and finally to the mutually interdependent during these past 8 years. In this final relationship, the Congress and the administration have, on most vital issues, cooperated well to serve the nation good rather than mere partisanship, and so have assured that the business of the nation should go forward. So my official relationship with the Congress ends in a feeling, on my part, of gratitude that we have been able to do so much together.
People voted for this U.S. president because they liked Ike.
Hang up the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're taking a look at the life and accomplishments of Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we can have peace with honor, reasonable security with national solvency. I believe in the future of the United States of America.
Dwight David Ike Eisenhower was born October 14, 1890 in Denison, Texas, and grew up in Abilene, Kansas as one of 7 boys. After developing an interest in the military from reading his mother's history books, he enrolled at West Point's Military Academy in New York. Upon graduation, he was shipped to Texas, where he met Mamie Doud. Once the pair married in 1916, Eisenhower spent the next years training recruits in tank warfare during World War I. By the end of the 1930s, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower was back in the U.S. after serving overseas. With his expertise and friendly personality, he advanced quickly through the ranks of World War II and was put in charge of several Allied invasions. Eventually, Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. During the war, Eisenhower earned a decisive Allied victory by launching history's largest amphibious invasion, the Normandy landings. He also helped the Allies win one of the war's biggest and deadliest clashes, the Battle of the Bulge. By the war's end, Eisenhower was promoted to 5-star general. After spending time as the Army's Chief of Staff, Eisenhower became president of Columbia University in 1948 and published a successful military memoir. Before vacating his position in the early 1950s, he took a brief leave and headed to Europe as Supreme Commander of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. In 1952, Eisenhower retired from the Army and entered politics. He won the Republican presidential nomination and launched the I Like Ike campaign.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president.
With his down-to-earth persona, a promise to end the Korean War, and Richard Nixon as his running mate, Eisenhower was elected president on November 4th, 1952.
We sense with all our faculties that forces of good and evil are masked and armed and opposed as rarely before in history.
During his presidency, Eisenhower showed conservative tendencies on the domestic front. He left most of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal programs in place, stressed the importance of a balanced budget, and decreased taxes. He also enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and took steps to stop racial segregation. Eisenhower's foreign efforts were focused on peace. Following the death of Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, Eisenhower pleaded for decreased spending on nuclear weapons in his Chance for Peace speech.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed.
Unfortunately, this did little to prevent the eventual expansion of the Cold War. In 1953, Eisenhower helped broker a truce in the Korean War. During this period, he also began advocating in favor of nuclear weapon use for diplomatic purposes, especially with his Atoms for Peace speech.
I feel impelled to speak today in a language that, in a sense, is new. One which I,
who have spent so much of my life in the military profession, would have preferred never to use. That new language is the language of atomic warfare.
His proposal of an international agency on the topic materialized with the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1957. In 1954, Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles attempted to thwart communism's spread with the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. The next year, he again tackled the nuclear threat during a summit in Geneva by suggesting the mutual air inspection of the US and Soviet Union's military equipment. However, the Soviets refused the Open Skies proposal. In 1956, Eisenhower's signing of the Federal Aid Highway Act permitted the eventual construction of the interstate highway system. That same year, he secured his second presidential term, despite a heart attack the year before. Following the Suez Crisis, the fight against communism continued. With the Eisenhower Doctrine, he offered American aid to threatened Middle Eastern countries. He also increased the country's commitment to space research after the Soviet satellite, Sputnik 1, was sent into orbit. This ultimately led to the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, in 1958. However, hopes of repairing relations with the Soviets were dashed when an American U-2 surveillance aircraft was found spying on the USSR in 1960. The next year, Eisenhower left office.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
He was reinstated as General of the Army and spent his retirement with his wife on a farm near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On March 28, 1969, Dwight Eisenhower died of heart failure. Though Eisenhower's administration was criticized for a brief economic recession, the U-2 incident, and its relationship with the USSR and the nuclear arms race, his presidential reputation is often viewed positively. In fact, some consider Dwight D. Eisenhower as one of the best presidents in American history.
And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love.
So as you can see from that series of videos, there's so many things we need to talk about. The first one is that this man who spent so much of his life and so much of his career as a military man fighting the America's wars, being one of the greatest military leaders, generals in American history and in world history, then goes on to later retire and spend the rest of his life trying to create peace, trying to end wars, trying to find ways to stay out of war, trying to find nuclear detente. So it's very, very interesting if you think about it. He had seen the horrors of war his entire career. He had been an incredible general and done incredible things for our country and for our allies. And yet he had seen how horrible war can be and therefore became a peacemaker for the rest of his life. So that's pretty impressive if you think about that. And you think about the other achievements he had. Not only did he win those incredible battles in World War II, but then in his presidency created all these different domestic programs that were incredibly important then and are still important in our lives today. The highway program, NASA, creating a more stable financial situation in our government, creating a balanced budget, continuing that had been put in place as safety nets for all of America and continuing those while continuing to balance the budget. Having prosperity all 8 of his years except for 6 months in 1958 where they had a slight recession. So he really had a number of incredible achievements, as you can see. He was a great president. And that really is unusual to have someone who has that great a presidency on top of being the supreme Allied commander of World War II and being a true military hero in our history. So hopefully you learned a lot about Dwight D. Eisenhower. We affectionately call him Ike. His history, his achievements, what he did in his military career, how he changed the war in so many different ways as our Supreme Allied Commander for the Allied Forces. And then, of course, in his really great 2 terms as president, he really was consequential. He did a lot of great things, being sandwiched in between several different wars, World War II, and then some of the later conflicts that he actually ended. He also, of course, ended Democratic rule and took over as a Republican, but as you saw, really ruled as a moderate Republican during his career. So hopefully you really enjoyed that. You learned a lot about Eisenhower. You want to dig into his history a little bit more and learn about this great president in our lifetime, the 34th president of the United States. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great content coming your way, and we'll see you next time on Traveling Through History. Have a great night.